Hello, everyone. It is fantastic to see you all here today, and welcome all to this very special Power Center event, Moving Forward with David Bohm. You all know me, but just to remind you, I'm James Barbieri, a member of Board of Directors here at Power Center, and I will be your host for today. Today with me, we also have Eleanor Peat, Program Director of the Power Center, who will assist me and you in this call. Before we begin, I'd just like to very quickly remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules for this session. During the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphone to ensure a better quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we can hear some background noise. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution to the discussion, which will happen towards the end of the session, please write your question in the chat section of the Zoom call. If you can't find it, I'll just send a message now so you can all see where it is. There we go. We also invite participants to turn on their video camera, as we believe that seeing everyone's faces and reactions creates a nice, inclusive education environment. However, if you don't feel comfortable turning on the camera on, free to keep it off. And also one last thing, all sessions will be recorded for archival purposes, but they will be available to you all. Now, let's begin the session. This event, Moving Forward with David Bohm, is a product of our online summer series, and everyone here has attended at least one of these sessions. During the series, we've been exploring Bohm's life and ideas by looking at his work in physics, for example, the hidden variables theory and his ideas of the implicate order. We've looked at Bohm's work on dialogue, and we've also looked at Bohm's interaction with indigenous knowledge, especially with the Black Book. Today, however, we will be looking at how these ideas can be developed and how it would affect us in the future. For this reason, we are going to welcome back a number of presenters from our Infinite Potential Summer Series as panelists in our final session to glance into the future. In alphabetical order, I'd like to welcome Chris Dewdney, who worked towards his PhD with David Bohm's group at Birkbeck College, and he rediscovered Bohm's hidden variables theory. Give us a wave, Chris.
Hi.
We have with us Leroy Little Bear, a Blackfoot native who was born and raised on the Blood Reserve in Alberta in Canada. A few months before David Bohm's death in 1992, Leroy helped organize a circle of First Nations people and Western scientists. It was an eye-opening experience for Bohm to find that he shared their worldview. Hello, Leroy.
Hello.
Today with us, we also have Nichol. For many years, Lee collaborated with David Bohm on various aspects of dialogue, consciousness, and education, and has edited a number of David Bohm's works, including The Essential David Bohm. Hello, Lee.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon.
On our panel, we also have Shantena Sabbadini, Director of the Power Center. Shantena is a quantum physicist and philosopher who looked at Bohm's notion of the implicate order and how it resonates with the Eastern notion of the Tao. Hello, Shantena.
Hello, James. Hello, everyone.
We also have David Schrum, who spent 2 years in postdoctoral studies with David Bohm at Birkbeck College in London. This is where he encountered Bohm's philosophical approaches to physics, the structure of consciousness, and what may lay beyond, and was introduced to Bohm's interest in philosopher J. Krishnamurti. Hello, Dave.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all.
And finally, we have Beth Macy, our facilitator for today. Beth Macy is a long-term Bohmian dialogue practitioner. She is completing a book on the ideas and individuals who influenced Bohm's methodology of dialogue. I'll pass it over straight to you, Beth.
Well, good morning and good evening, whatever. I don't know about the rest of you, but last weekend was really bleak for me. I'd gotten so used to the PARI series, filling up my weekend with really new thoughts and all your faces that it seemed like it was just really empty. So I'm really pleased, and I want to just say thank you to the PARI Center for hearing some of us with our pleas to have one last session. I just really think this is an opportunity to push the ideas a little further. In fact, one of the things I really liked about the documentary was watching Lee Nichol describing how Bohm liked to push and push and push the edges out. And so this is our opportunity as a group to really do some further pushing and to go beyond maybe what we've thought of thus far about Bohm and his way in the world and what he's left us, but really to push that legacy out further. And so we've been calling this looking at the edges or the still untapped potentials of David Bohm's legacy that still are to be explicated. So we'd like you to join us in a new way, some new thinkings, not new thoughts, but new thinkings about David Bohm and where we might go in the future with David Bohm. So we're going to be operating a little bit differently than we have in the prior sessions. And so I want to just, first of all, kind of walk you through how today's going to work. So the first thing is that of the 6 of us on the panel today, there'll be a question that I will pose to each person. And the purpose of that question is try to help that presenter to push forward their own thinking. Now, we don't know what each other is going to say, so this is going to be all new to all of us. And after we've shared how we respond to those questions, we're going to have a conversation amongst us that says, so what might have been common in what each of us presented? And keep in mind, each one of us will have tried to push our own future a bit, our future thinking. So what's common in what we've been talking about here? And then secondly, how can that add to the ideas that would be the future edge, the unpacked potential that's still there to be mined? Following that, we're going to have an opportunity for some questions from those of you who are the participants. Now, the way to do that, as James said, is write your questions into the chat. And because we aren't going to have a whole lot of time for that part of it, we're asking Eleanor and James to be watching the chat and then to pick out from what you've submitted, what are the edgiest of the edgy questions that then can come back to the panel for us to do a little bit of ruminating on. So that's kind of the flow. And there's some things that we would like to ask of you as the listeners, participants. Now, in dialogue, we like to use the concept of a container. You know, what is it that holds the boundaries and gives us the safety to explore new thinking together? And so that's what we really need for you to do for us today, as those of us who are the ones conversing are doing that. So we would really recommend for you to set aside what you've thought about regarding Bohm before, and then hold the empty energy of, I've forgotten which of the physicists in our conversations thus far was talking about the idea, Bohm's idea of the empty space, or physics idea of the empty space, that really that's the plenum, that's the place of potentiality. So we're really trying to reach forward into what goes beyond his thought that's happened so far. So we ask us all then to kind of hold that space for that emptiness, for the new ideas. And particularly when you put your questions into chat, really go for the things that haven't come to you before. So we're all really educated here in Bohm's thinking. What comes to you that's new? What are the new questions? So that's what we would like for all of us to engage in together. So with that, I say, let's begin. Now, just to give you a little bit of sense of the order, as Eleanor suggested, we're really trying to follow the order in our conversations today in how David Bohm's life went. So we're going to start with science, and so Chris is going to get to be first in a moment. And then we kind of move into more the philosophical, the more maybe metaphysical ideas, and then into dialogue, and finally with Leroy, who's the one can help us bridge across all those. So I'm going to start with Chris, and I have a question for Chris. And you know, you have to keep in mind that those of us who are in the panel don't see each other all together in one spot. So wherever you are, Chris, I'm sorry, I don't see you at the moment. But here's the idea I would have for Chris. I was really intrigued with your story when you did your presentation about being in the bookstore across the street from Birkbeck, picking up a book that had David Bohm's article, his 1952 article in it. And you had said how both de Broglie's and Bohm's ideas had been pushed back into the wilderness. But in effect, you pulled those ideas back from the wilderness back into today's thinking. And I'm seeing that with all the attention that's come, and I think that Paul Howard had said there's someplace close to 500,000 people who've seen the documentary thus far. So with all that attention, where do you think the ideas that you helped retrieve so long ago, where can those ideas go now? What do you see as the potential within physics for David Bohm's ideas? So I'll hand that off to you now.
Okay, thanks very much, Beth. What is probably one of the most difficult questions anybody could ask, in fact. But I thought before, looking into that, perhaps we shouldn't underestimate the impact that David Bohm's ideas have already had within the interpretation of quantum theory and within the way people are thinking about quantum theory. So I think, David Bohm's ideas have already shifted the center of thought about quantum mechanics. I can say that when we kind of rediscovered Bohm's 52 theory back in 1979, the book actually was a survey of hidden variable theories by Belinfanti, which I came across, which has a chapter about Bohm's theory in it, just a matter of information. But it's certainly true that back then the theory was largely forgotten about. Nobody was really taking this theory very seriously. Everyone thought, even if they'd even heard about the theory, that it was obviously false, it had been disproved. At conferences, when I started going to conferences, it was clear that nobody really, well, with notable exceptions, nobody was really taking the theory seriously. It was a seemingly abstract construction, and it didn't really attract that much attention, even within interpretation of quantum theory circles. So there were many objections back then, but I think one of the key features actually is that it was really the visualization of the theory, I think, which played quite an important part in getting people more interested in it. Because rather than just being presented with a mathematical reformulation of the theory, they could actually see images which explained it. They could watch, as I've said before, they could actually watch quantum particles tunneling through potential barriers and so on. But even when I used to show those images and movies at conferences, people were convinced that there was something fishy going on. After all, hadn't von Neumann proved that hidden variables couldn't exist? Hadn't Bell, in fact, proved that hidden variables couldn't exist? And even when you convinced them that those proofs didn't apply, they would still argue, oh, well, the theory is artificial, it's contrived, it was non-local. This was taken in those days as a real problem of the theory. But of course, today, I think there aren't many people left who would try to argue that quantum theory is a local theory. And we used to have, long discussions at these conferences afterwards in the bar normally. And, you could go through all the arguments, and in the end, people would just say, well, I just don't like it. It's just not my thing. It's not the way physics should be done. You can't test it. So it's just metaphysics. It's all irrelevant. And back in those days, even well-respected philosophers such as Michael Redhead could write a textbook about the interpretation of quantum theory in which Bohm's interpretation didn't even get a mention. So as a measure, really, of the impact that Bohm's physics has had already, that if you go to a conference on interpretation of quantum theory today, if you look at any textbook which has come out, or any popular account of quantum theory which has come out, they all, without exception, have a section about Bohm's theory. And Bohm's theory is now taken seriously. Nobody writes about interpretation of quantum mechanics and ignores Bohm's theory. So we shouldn't really underestimate the impact that it's already had within physics. Having said that, however, within what you might call mainstream physics, I guess, his theory is not actually being used, certainly at present, to drive things forward. I think mainstream physics, for many reasons, has gone on its own way, not so much influenced by Bohm's theory, but certainly when talking about interpretation, it comes in. And I think it's also had an impact on some of the new experiments which are being done, which perhaps I'll talk about a little bit later. So I think Bohm's theory, has been a liberation within physics already. It's caused a stirring or an awakening from the enchantment of the Copenhagen interpretation. We don't rest our heads on that pillow any longer. But, this then raises the question, that, okay, given all that, how should we actually take Bohm's theory within physics? And I think Bohm himself, and I think many others, not everybody in the field of Bohm's interpretation, but I think many people would say is what we shouldn't do is take it as a literal description of an objective, independent reality. It's not just an extension of a Newtonian view of the world, but now we have a non-local quantum potential. I think this would be a misreading of Bohm's theory, and it's certainly a misreading of Bohm's intentions and the direction of travel that Bohm was going in. So I think we'll talk perhaps a little bit more about that during the discussion. But I think another impact that we can see already that Bohm's theory has had is in the stimulation to do new experiments, perhaps based on these weak measurement techniques. The Steinberg group, who did the two slits reconstruction of the trajectories experiment, perhaps they wouldn't have carried out such an experiment had the Bohm theory not existed. And now, of course, the same group have done measurements on quantum tunneling. And again, I would think that there's been some influence from Bohm's ideas in stimulating those experiments. The two-slit experiment was done with photons, and the tunneling experiment was done with massive particles. The UCL experiments, which Basil was involved in, are also again being done with massive particles, and we're looking forward to seeing the outcome of those experiments. But I think we should be careful not to overplay those experiments in terms of proving the existence of the quantum potential, phrase which I've heard stated. I think it would definitely be overplaying it to suggest that the reconstruction of those two slit trajectories is really a verification of direct verification of Bohm's interpretation and the trajectories which you can calculate in his theory. Those results of those experiments, of course, have a perfectly good understanding within what you might call standard quantum theory. They are quantum measurements of average momentum at a point, and you can then use those measurements to reconstruct trajectories. What they don't do is they don't measure individual trajectories of individual particles, which I think is what some people would say, well, the theory is still unobservable in that sense because we are not observing individual particle trajectories. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think it's also important to remember that in Bohm's view, in his quantum theory, photons, which were used in the two-slit experiment to reconstruct those flow lines, perhaps you'd better call them, they don't even have trajectories in Bohm's view. And I think in some ways it's understandable because Bohm's view is always explained in terms of massive particles because the theory is more intuitive and it's more immediately accessible, and it makes sense, that a given detector fires because that individual particle actually went to that detector. Okay, it's a very straightforward, simple view. But I think in some ways, I think Bohm's interpretation of field theory and his interpretation of quantum electrodynamics is in many ways more instructive of his more general views. But again, theories, and I myself don't often present it using the quantum electrodynamics view because it isn't so intuitive. But I think it's closer, what the picture you get is actually closer to his more general ideas about the nature of reality and so on. So I think, perhaps more discussion of his interpretation of quantum field theory would be instructive and more informative for his philosophical ideas. In fact, this is David Schrum emphasized this in his talk when he was talking about the importance of the Dirac sea in all of this. It's also, I think, misleading because the massive particle could be interpreted as supporting the view that we're just going back to a Newtonian view, but now with embedded non-locality. So am I going on too long?
So.
Okay, let me
bring it to a close. Yeah.
Let me just say. So I think
Very interesting. Great.
I think we've got to be careful not to squeeze Bohm's view about quantum mechanics into the metaphysical bottle of Enlightenment metaphysics. This was emphasized again by Leroy in his talk, and I think the attempt to do so misses the essence of Bohm's thought and will divert us away from where Bohm wanted us to go. I mean, today quantum mechanics is big business. Billions of dollars are spent exploiting quantum features of the world in which non-locality and EPR entanglement plays a strong part. But I haven't actually seen any papers or discussion which ever mentions Bohm's theory in this. So the technological implications and aspects of quantum theory are going ahead at a pace without that. But I think the physicists adopt this in general, adopt this very utilitarian view. They have a natural attitude. It's called the natural attitude in philosophy, that there's a world out there which is fixed and formed, and our experiments and our analysis are simply there to reveal this, and the human agent in all of this plays no real essential role. And I think that is the natural attitude. And I think an example of this perhaps would be that when people are looking for an explanation of EPR non-locality, one idea which has come up recently is that it could be explained through Einstein-Rosen bridges. So they're trying to use wormholes in space-time to explain this linking of distant regions and distant particles, but which, for me is an attempt to stay within the existing paradigm. We peer through our microscopes, our telescopes, our particle accelerators, our abstract mathematics, really is a reified world, a non-human world. And we neglect that we are not only part of this world, but that we actually create it through thought. As Lee has emphasized in his talk, in many ways, Bohm viewed the world as thought. And as Beth, you yourself emphasized that everything's created through dialogue, not just between people, but between consciousness and matter, between which, in Bohm's view, there's no sharp boundary. So the big question, which you asked me at the beginning, was how can we create a new physics, a new order of understanding of all that is, from which human consciousness is not excluded at the outset by explicit construction. Our Western science actually explicitly excludes consciousness and the human agent in its very formulation. And I think when we think about it, there are particular things that we can look at to see how this can be taken forwards. But obviously, it's a gradual process, and we need to look at places where there's some indication of a new order, where we get a glimpse of a new order within physics and build on those. So, as Jan has emphasized, emergent phenomena is an example where we see a different sort of thing. Paul Davis, in a great book, which I found absolutely fascinating, has argued that we need a new physics. And I think there are many parallels with Davis's thought and Bohm's thought. And he argues that our new physics must incorporate a formative role for information within the basic laws of physics. Certainly if we're ever to understand life and consciousness, we need to look at the organizing potential of information. Bohm himself refers to the information potential. Other places we could look at, well, Basil Hiley, I think, is almost alone in taking forward ways of mathematizing Bohm's ideas about, the intricate order and how we can formulate that. Okay, almost finished.
Yeah, good.
So I think, we need to allow this new physics to emerge from a holistic concept of nature, including human consciousness, this concept of the intricate order. And wholeness and unity must be fundamental, and locality and individuals must emerge from this. And Bohm said some pretty outlandish things, I think, which didn't endear him to many physicists. For example, the idea that electrons have consciousness. Well, we heard earlier in the series about rocks having Bohm arguing that rocks have a proto-consciousness, and people kind of laugh at that. But that's really just to misunderstand and not really take on board fully what Bohm was trying to say. And it's a very deep and subtle argument, which you need to go through. But it's clear that if we're going to move forward in physics, we can't just keep peering down our microscopes and looking through our telescopes with that particular mindset. We have to try and start from another place and take on board the idea that an electron has proto-consciousness. I mean, average size of the electrons taken 10 to the minus 16 meters. Galaxy is, nearest galaxy is 10 to the minus 24 10 to the 24 centimeters wide.
Yeah.
That's a huge amount of structure.
Chris.
So
Yeah.
just last sentence, I think there are two things going on here. There's Bohm's influence within the way we have to conceive of the human condition and the human position within the world and our relationship to how we construct the theory of matter. And I think, you know, what I'm hoping will happen is that these two flows, when many people here are interested in Bohm's philosophical ideas, and we've heard a lot about that, not so many in physics are interested, but you know, these two flows, I think when these two flows come together, they will create a much stronger stream in which we will see some paradigmatic shifts. I hope so. Yeah. Sorry, I can't tell you where physics is going on Bohm's view, but I have a hope for the future that if enough people start to think along Bohm's lines, both in philosophy and within physics, that we will be able to reconceive our physics in a more general way.
Yeah.
So, okay, sorry, that was quite a lot, but
yeah, great. Thank you, Chris. Lots and lots to ponder. I would love to see all that written up, and maybe what all of us write up, because I think there's so much embedded there that it's going to take a lot to really digest it. So I'm going to switch then to Shantena. And Shantena, I'm thinking about your presentation in representing two very different tracks. You know, one of them, the current thinking and being a theoretical physicist, being the very scientific orientation. And then the other being taking that very deep wisdom tradition of Taoism. So I'm wondering if you could help us look just briefly, and I'm going to say that since we're a little bit behind schedule, if you could be a little brief with it, but look into what are the, you might say, complementary or the different or the common things between these two very different tracks that you've taken in your life. How do they come together? And if there is common ground between such a wisdom tradition as Taoism and theoretical physics, what does that tell us about where we could go in the future? So, a few moments for you.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Beth. Yes, and in some ways, this will be a comment on some part of what Chris just told us. I think we could correctly speak of complementarity between the scientific approach and the mystic experience. And Tao is not only a tradition of mystic experience, which starts from the statement that the Tao that can be spoken is not the Tao. So it starts from a critique of the presumptuous use of language as descriptor of reality. And it reminds us from the very beginning that the map is not the territory. And all our pictures of reality are pictures. And I one of the root causes of the disasters we're living is the fact that we forget about the entire picture and we select, we stick. Science has become in some ways the religion of our time. And this religion is based on some criteria of reproducible experiment, of this mathematical description, which are all very useful and powerful tools, but they're not the entire picture. So being conscious of this, let's say, double dimension of reality and experience, which is one is based on looking for the abstract skeleton of reality, But the other one being like the fullness of experience with all its undescribable, ungraspable totality. So I think that's a point where two such different picture as science and contemporary physics need to come together, and I think that was a deep thread running through David Bohm's project. And the challenge that poses is still very open, and I think it's definitely one of the lines of investigation and understanding and education, I would say, that David Bohm has left for us to mine. Yes, I think we can.
So, Shantena, do you see a way in which that bridging can occur?
I think that bridging is occurring in many ways. Like in one way, it's like physics itself is getting closer to including the dimension of mind. It's probably saying too much, but it's moving in that direction, and that's another one of David's key ideas. It's like a description of reality which does not include mind consciousness is obviously an incomplete description of reality. It cuts off what is actually our first experience, our ground of all we can say about reality is what we experience, is consciousness. So correcting this one-sidedness of our present-day physics, I think it's a crucial step, not only for physics, but for the future of the human species.
I asked you to be brief, but you don't have to be so brief. Do you want to say a little bit more?
Well, that's the essence of what I meant to say. But of course, later on in the question section, we can deepen that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk to David Schrum for a few moments. So, David, my question for you, I'm thinking about the overall series of presentations and the fact that quite often, and even this morning, we're talking about there being divides between the scientific orientation, but then also the more intuitive, psychological, metaphysical approach. And I had the idea in listening to your presentation that there may appear to be some of both sides, and even David Bohm's presentations. Yeah, I mean his overall work, that we see some sense of fragmentation between those two. And then in your presentation, you were talking about how there's fragmentation, and I want to read this from my notes from your presentation, that there's fragmentation at the personal, the collective, and the cosmic levels. So fragmentation happens in each of those. And then you spent a really fine amount of time talking about participative understanding. So I'm wondering if the participative understanding is part of the resolution of this fragmentation. And if you could kind of go into that a little bit and say, is that part of where we need to be going in order to deal with fragmentation in general? So over to you.
Well, okay, we have a week-long discussion here, but
Maybe a little shorter than that.
yeah, I think a little shorter. Let's look at part of it. Let's look at the question, the matter of the disjunction between content-based mind, what Bohm called literal thought, and process-based mind, participatory thought. You mentioned a disjunction there, how maybe they don't always come together well, how there may be a problem in that. So what I'd like to say first is these two aspects have been key to our evolutionary survival. And it must have been that they worked beautifully, harmoniously, in complementary ways to get us here, biologically. So first of all, that, they can do it. And then when we talked about Albert Einstein and his mental processes, Albert Einstein mind, when he was revealing them, again, we see those two different aspects working in harmony in a complementary way. Einstein starts from something which is entirely pre-verbal, something entirely non-verbal, which we all have in us. It's all quite foundational to us. And from this fluid, open moving, perceptive, aware, attentive field of embodied understanding, he feels his way into it. He moves with it. He plays with it. It's a kind of play, really. And he lets it bring itself to its own order, and he discovers this order, and he goes through the hard work of concretizing it, bringing it over into the other, into literal understanding, into discrete ideas, sequential reasoning, logic, the whole thing. So there it is. It works just fine. Why not for us? In our culture, in our society in general. Well, let's note what Einstein did. He worked from the vastness, from the open space, from the undefined, from the implicate, from process and movement in an embodied sense. But he worked from something vast, large, beyond finite measure. And then he worked with it, developed it, articulated it, brought it into sequential order, mathematized it, languaged it, the whole thing. And there's this beautiful creation. So we see these two things work well together. They're the essence of creativity, of intelligence, perception, insight, and so on. So why isn't that working so well for me? Put it that way. Well, I've been raised in a culture which is starting from the particular, from the content-based mind, from the little thing. And from the little thing, if I want to be creative, I have to use the arms of the little to try to reach out to the big. And it doesn't work very well. That whole process doesn't work very well. So the content-based mind is basically, we just take it for granted. I'm going to work from my framework of thinking, the way I think about things, the way I feel about things, my experience. I trust that framework, right? And so does everybody else. He trusts their individual frameworks. And so each of us has our own, as Bohm would point out, personal reality. It's real to me, If my mind tells me something is true, my thoughts, my emotions, then obviously it's true. But somebody else's thoughts and emotions are telling them something else. And so how do we meet this? You see, I don't think we can meet it from the little space. So it's a question then of different realities. We're talking about my reality. And what Bohm says is we have to enter into reality participatively, to go into it as process, in which way we can become intimate with it, discover what it really is, what its strengths are, and what its limitations are. And as we see this, we begin to discover that my reality, which I think is telling me the essence of everything, is really It's a tool for navigating through the world, but it's limited.
Mhm.
And when I begin to see that my reality is limited, is a very small, finite thing, if I begin to actually see that, then that whole basis of that being the essence of things has been undercut. And I'm left in mystery. And so then from mystery, you see, I can see a sense of mystery. I can gain a sense of what reality is as a tool, as something that works, with which I can work. Now, interestingly, from my earliest days at Birkbeck College in the early 1970s, when I went to be with Bohm, we would sit in the Birkbeck cafeteria over cups of tea, maybe with a few other students, maybe with an extra professor or something. And our talk wasn't about quantum physics, mostly. It was about mind and reality. And what I remember Bohm talking about first was mystery. The fact that really that the whole, that we all have a sense of somehow knowing what the universe is, what life is, and so on, that we carry explicitly. We think we may not know a lot of details and so on, but we've really got the idea. And Bohm was saying, maybe that's not so at all. And he liked to bring out examples of Newton and Einstein, who both saw life as a deep, profound mystery. And their own work is something very small, sort of on the surface of this. So Einstein, yes, saw nature, life as incredibly, a deep, profound mystery on which he was doing this little bit of work on the surface. He'd like to tell the story of Newton also, who at the end of his life, sort of at the height of his fame, said that he didn't know how other people saw him, but for himself, he felt like a small boy playing on the seashore. You're picking up a smoother stone or a prettier shell, where before him, the great ocean of truth lay all unexplored. So this is the Bohm feeling for science, for mind, for life as a whole. And he was trying to open the door to us to participate in mystery. Now, we don't go out looking for the unknown. How can you do that? What we do is we go into the known. We participate in it fully, intimately, in every way we can, in an embodied way, heartfelt way, mind, the whole thing. And in entering into its process, participatively, we begin to sense its limitations. When I sense the limitations of my reality, which is really factual, my reality, this is fact, this is not fancy. When I sense it factually and deeply, I am in mystery, because I know I can't trust my reality to tell me the essence of things. It really works in functioning in the world. So, yeah, I don't want to go on long about this, but so in all his work, we can see that David Bohm is opening the door in one way or another to us beginning to participate in the mystery. And from there, we can have a different order of mind, a different order of relationship, a different order of society, a transformation of the whole. And however we do that depends on us individually, our own creative process, our own insight, and so on. And each of us may have a small part to play, relationally or whatever. Some may work in science, some may do something in art, so on. So that's, well, I'm kind of going on, but yes, that's, I would say, where David Bohm, in my understanding, is pointing us toward the future.
Love that, David, thinking about just the ideas that mystery brings. So that's really great. Thank you. So we want to switch gears just a little bit and move more into the ideas in back of dialogue. And Lee, I wanted to share something that I pulled out of your presentation. that I thought was really an interesting way of describing what David Bohm wanted for us to be able to experience in dialogue. So I want to read this so I get it right. So you said that Bohm's aim for us within dialogue is touching into the cosmic aspect of human beings, which unfolds both the collective and the individual aspects of the human being. So the cosmic as unfolding the collective and the individual aspects, and that being the essence of dialogue. So another thing you said that just really intrigued me was that Bohm also talked about what you've put the title on, the trickster within our own thought, which seems to me, which is part of what keeps us from probably getting into those other levels of dialogue that you talked about. So I'm curious if you could tell us, how did Bohm, even though he didn't use the word trickster, he clearly knew the meaning of that and thought, how did he go about taming his own trickster? That's one question for you. And then secondly, if we were to dialogue together in a way that taps into that cosmic level, what would that be like, and what would come as a result of that? So two questions. How did he deal with the trickster? And secondly, assuming he did and we could, then how would that go into this cosmic kind of dialogue? For you. And you're muted.
Things out. Is that
That's it.
better? Okay.
You got
good.
it. Yeah.
Well, on the first point, just to say a little bit about the trickster, that aspect of thought, I think the idea really is that we're sleepwalking in life. And David used the term, I think, electrochemical fog, that we're enveloped in this electrochemical fog of thought, this rapid fire thinking, feeling, all of that coming out of memory and creating this electrochemical fog that we live in. So all of that's being produced by thought. And then thought is also saying to us, you're wide awake. You're not in a fog. You're not sleepwalking. You're completely wide awake. So that's really the essence of the trick, that we think we're wide awake. We think we're seeing the world as it is. But there are all these complicating factors, programs running in the background. The whole construction of thought and feeling is driving all of that, and we don't see it. We think we're awake. So that's one way to encapsulate the trickster notion. So how did David tame that? I don't think he did. I don't think that he tamed it. But what he did do, in my observation, was to see the danger of that, to see very clearly and hold very deeply the danger of that electrochemical fog that's both individual and collective. And I think from seeing that danger, he then developed this intention, a really powerful intention to do what he could, the best he could, to dispel that fog in himself and to share with other people how he saw that electrochemical fog, that sleepwalking, how he saw all that operating. And of course, he brought this brilliant scientific mind to that task and gave us a lot of clues and a marvelous map for that exploration. But really, I think he had to work at it in perpetuity. He had to work at it constantly. I don't think he was ever in a position where he was totally immune from that electrochemical fog. And I don't know that I've ever met anyone who has that kind of immunity. That the feeling of that, the concept of a person who is completely free from that, totally, is not subject to falling back into it. That's really, I think, a kind of strange ideal that is not helpful in doing the type of things that David was talking about.
Yeah.
So again, back to that simple point, he was like us. He had to come at this again and again, and he was very diligent about it, and he was very determined in that exploration. And to this day, to me, that's an incredible inspiration to recall the depth of his commitment to it, day after day after day. So let's see, the second question was about what would a dialogue look like that kind of has the cosmic as its container, as you were saying earlier.
Well said.
And then unfolds the collective and the individual. Gosh, I don't know. I would like to find out what that would look like. And maybe that's part of the edge that we could look at pushing here, is what would that look like? It makes me recall and think of one thing in particular. You know, I've been working in and out of dialogue for 30 years now. And one thing that I've never seen that, at least for me, would be new, for other people, this might not be a new thing. I never was in a group, a dialogue group, a Bohm dialogue group, in which everyone in the group, or 99% of the people in the group, had really carefully studied what David Bohm said about dialogue. And I would be so excited, if Corona ever sets us free, to be in a dialogue group in which people had really worked at understanding what David said would be a good experiment. Because there's a lot of things in his version of dialogue that are really unique and powerful. And those often tend to be the things that get plucked out when people just want a more generic form of dialogue. So I would be thrilled to see what would happen if there were Bohm dialogue groups, not as ideologues, right? Not slavishly following David Bohm, but people that had really carefully looked into what his proposal for dialogue was really about. And that group could then proceed, or those groups could then proceed. So, like I said, for me, that would be a new thing. For other people, there may have been people that have had that experience, and that would interest me to know how that's gone. But I think that would be something wonderful for the future of dialogue.
Yeah. Well, you humanize David Bohm by the way you speak there. You take him off our pedestal and let him be a human, which probably he didn't get the chance to be dealt with very often. So thank you for saying both the inspirational side of him, but also the struggle that we all have, but he shared as well. Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you.
So I want to take off my moderator hat for a moment and let Shantena ask me a question, if he's there. Oh, maybe we lost Shantena. Shall I ask myself a question? Can I do that? Can I talk to myself?
He's there. Oh no, he's not there.
I know he's had some internet problems, and so, well, I'll share with you what I've been thinking about in terms of edges. I want to be a little bit edgy on my edge here. So I come with probably a different perspective than most of you. My background training is as an organizational theorist. And so my training is to look at organizations in terms of their life cycle, in terms of what makes organization work or not. And when I think about the potential that's come from...
Beth, can you?
Yeah, okay, there you are. Go ahead. Shantena, now we're not getting you, so I'm going to just go ahead, if you don't mind. So, anyway, forgive our technology issues here then. So what I wanted to share is, from my viewpoint, when an organization, or it could be a field, or it could be a person, goes through a rapid growth, we tend to think about that growth as being the desired point. You know, that's really good when things grow. And from my background, what I've seen happen many times is growth can be very detrimental. So here we are on the edge of all this new awareness about Bohm, and I'm saying, let's look a little bit here, because I think there could also be some danger points that come up. So what tends to make for effective growth is when there's clear sense of the identity, the pattern that underlies the identity of something, so that whoever is the purveyor of this entity doesn't get seduced away by new opportunity to grow away from what's really core. And in some ways, I think there is a lot of core thinking around Bohm, probably more so in the science area, but in more of the softer areas, the philosophical, and particularly in the dialogue areas, I see there a lot of fragmentation. And Lee, I think you kind of broached that as well. I think that people have picked up a lot of Bohm's thinking and used their own subjectivity to try to build a school of dialogue, or build a way of going about dialogue. And again, Lee, as you kind of tapped into, a lot of times it kind of moves away from what David Bohm's original intentions were. So my concern is that there needs to be some concerted thinking under the surface about what are the core things that are involved here in Bohm's thinking before too much exportation and projection of these ideas happens. Now, in my presentation, and if some of you weren't with us, what I was attempting to present is what I felt was the core underlying pattern of David Bohm's own life, and then how that impacted his science and his ideas about dialogue and other things. I use the idea of Hegel as what most described, and what very clearly described, I think, David Bohm's life and science and work. But the interesting thing to me is, as I've listened to all the rest of the presentations, I'm interested in the real deep overlaps between what I was describing as Hegel's contribution to David Bohm's life. By that I mean the opposition, the idea of there being pairs of opposing parts of things, and that tension's necessary and gives the opportunity for something new. So when Chris was talking, he shared the idea of the upspin, downspin, and his way of having put some animation behind that made it so meaningful. But, you know, again, there's the tension between up and down. Or I I think that if I looked at every one of the presentations almost, there was something that talked about the opposition and the necessity of that opposition in order to fuel something new. So I'm kind of wondering, in answer to my own dilemma that I presented, is there maybe a pattern beneath the patterns that we've all been talking about? Is there something really core, essential about all these different facets of David Bohm that we've shared that really holds common meaning? And that then if we were able to articulate that, could then help this potential of really exponential growth that's possible now to have more coherence to it. So that would be my idea of the future, is if there could be ways in which we really focus in on what's essential. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't going to play out quite differently in science than it does in these other areas. But I still have to think that there's something very basic and deeply common. If you look at David Bohm and the way he talks, when he talks, he's not separating out physics and life. He's really talking, he may be talking to scientists, but he may be bringing in the philosophical parts. And when he's talking to us who are interested in dialogue, he may be talking about the implicate and explicate. So my sense of listening to and reading his work is he had ways in which these came together. He may not have quite finished those, but I just think there's something really deep there that is essential to push forward the coherence of thinking as we move forward. So that would be my advocacy, is to somehow have that way in which we could bring these various viewpoints down to the essential core. And so with that, I'm going to take off my panelist hat again and go back to being a moderator here. And Shantena, if you've come back on, my apologies for moving on without you. But now, let's talk to Leroy. And Leroy, I think of you as being a very unique person here, in that I don't think there are probably too many people who have become proficient in living on both sides of what we might call a divide. So on one hand, clearly being an attorney, being a professor, living in, to a large degree, into the more Western way of thinking, you've obviously got lots of capacity of living in the reasoned world. But on the other hand, you were brought up on native territory. I don't mean just physical territory, but mental territory, so that you really embody that sense of flow and wholeness that underlies the more native thinking. So I'm curious, from your viewpoint, your two viewpoints, if you could talk about how the bridging, or really more the penetrating between those two sides can occur. I remember you talking about there being a tight boundary between the worlds that the Western side tends to keep, and that we Westerners tend to want to go around the boundary instead of through it. How could we go through it, both at a personal level, at a societal level, and then what would that tell us about the edges of David Bohm's work? So over to you.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Okay, nestunna kauk hikaskiniwa. Inaksiks kanau nohtu tu. So kitapio. Kene nohtu tsitapi. Kui just tokits. Kskanatoni tsipukak. Hidoch kidak supuchti sa tupua. Sanita biwa. What I was telling you last night, I laid down, basically to lay down in bed to go to sleep. And when I say I laid down, I've really said I've made myself thin so that, and all the implications of that is that so that all the forces around me won't be as harsh and won't be hitting me as directly. So when I say I'm gonna lay down, I laid down, it just I'm making myself thin. Nitsipukak means I woke up, but that's the easy English translation. But in reality, what nitsipukak means, I'm rising with awareness. In other words, I'm coming out of my sleep and I'm rising with awareness. And one of the other expressions we asked was, I was going to ask all of you, Tsanitapi. The easy English translation is, how are you? But in reality, it really means, how are you connected?
Mm.
Api, Tsanita, Piu. Api is light. It can also describe a connection, something, a connector, like a rope. But it's also the notion of light. So, Pi, Tsanita, Piu, begins to say, how are you connected? Meaning with the energy force. In this case, if we want to say electromagnetism.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the point to be made is that our languages really colonize us. We think that we have freedom of thought, when in reality, our languages really colonize us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they shape how we see the world. They shape how we think. So, at the expense of, and at the risk of repeating myself from earlier presentations and at dialogues that we've conducted, I have used a number of, examples over and over again. And one of them is that to show the difference between English and Blackfoot, okay? English, the ordinary English sentence, I should say, is A is B. okay? A is B or A equals B. Now, if that's the case, if A equals B, why do I need B? If they're the same, why do I need B? So in English, the thinking process is such that you always need the other. In other words, you always have to go across the equal sign. You always need the other for reference. Say, in Blackfoot, I'm it, I'm just A, or I'm just B. I don't need the other. And there's a lot of other indigenous languages throughout the world that are similar to Blackfoot. See? So that has lots of implications, see? And I could draw it down to all what's going on and what has resulted out of COVID-19 and so forth, but we don't have time for that. The other example you brought up that I have used many, many times is the dichotomous nature, the binary nature of Euro languages like English. And that's where we get into things like black and white. And see, there are values and so on that are associated with just black and white, with just day and night, say. In Christian views, anything associated with darkness has evil overtones attached to it, see. And, you know, so you can go down a long list of dichotomous notions, black and white, saint and sinner, you know, day and night, you know. So you can go down the list, see. And as you pointed out, there is a watertight boundary between, let's say, good and evil. It's a watertight boundary. And so that from a Euro, and in this case, English thought, because of that watertight boundary, you cannot be good and evil at the same time. See, you are either or. See, it's always either or. See, and, you know, so, you know, animate, inanimate. So a rock is classified as inanimate. It can never be animate. See? Whereas in Blackfoot, hey, I can talk to a rock, you know. Nobody would think I was nuts talking to a rock, you know. See? As I jokingly say, they'd probably join the conversation if somebody else, another Blackfoot, heard me talking to the rock. They'd probably join the conversation. So all those, you know, that kind of classification, that kind of development in the language. Of course, if you were to step back a little bit further as we said in our presentation, he said, hey, those arise out of the metaphysics of the society. And those metaphysics in turn are shaped by the early relationships of the society to its environment. And this includes the cosmos, the animals, the plants, and so on. See? And of course, the language is developed to support, to express those views that those metaphysics bring about as interpretations and so on. See? So our views and consequently our language that makes us see the world, that makes us interpret the world in certain ways, all they are is interpretive templates. Yeah. And so I would say David Bohm was looking for an interpretive template to get past all the different boundaries brought about by culture, by the scientific world, and so on. In other words, each layer brings about boundaries. So from that point of view, that's why I had said, I think about David Bohm as an artist, because artists and poets have freedom in crossing boundaries, So if we can allow ourselves to cross those boundaries, see, maybe we'll begin to see what David Bohm was talking about when he talks about things like hidden variables. See, from a Blackfoot perspective, I don't have to worry about the hidden variables because as David was mentioning, there's the content mind and there's the process mind. Well, in Blackfoot, we lean more towards the process mind, and so our language is more process oriented. Okay, so we never talk about things as they really are. All we talk about is how they manifest, okay? The manifestation of the process, okay? So I'm forever just describing the manifestation of the hidden variable, so to speak. I'm just describing the manifestation into the explicit, the flux. So that's how my language speaks and so on. That's how my thought process in Blackfoot works. See? So let's learn how to jump over those hurdles. Let's learn how to jump over those boundaries. Mathematics is a good language, but it draws strong boundaries. Science, Western science, is great. It's brought us, the technological aspect of it is great, but hey, it's built a lot of boundaries. We need to be able to jump over those boundaries. Let me just say a couple of things with regard to, what Lee had said about dialogue, okay? Lee is very correct in what he said about David Bohm's notion about dialogue. And nobody's really studied, and really has a good understanding of that. Okay. One way to look at dialogue is, as David himself talked about it, is to get rid of all your hang-ups, all your tacit infrastructures, as he calls them, okay? Hey, let's get rid of that, and so on, and come clean, okay? In other words, as you get into the dialogue, you should become more and more acultural without, and leaving all the biases and defenses that you carry around, all the baggage that you carry around on a daily basis, see? So that we can have a much more, if I can use the word, sometimes I have problems with it, objective view. I don't know that there is such a thing, okay? And the more you become acultural, okay, the dialogue itself should come to, in other words, you should talk yourself out. In other words, you come to one mind. You talk yourself out. You come to a point of one mind. And that's why in dialogues, you have no agenda. You have no resolutions at the end of the dialogue, because once you have one mind, yes.
Yeah.
And if you will allow me, let me throw out one more thing that may be a little bit controversial, and that is, but it's not unrelated to what I've said before, and that is language. If I can use the word, maybe it's not the best word, but language is a sign of primitiveness.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. We think about, let me use the fish, which I always use, the fish. And scientists are saying those little murmurs we're finding that we hear between are the beginnings of a language, when in reality, it's really just the last inklings of them being 100% one mind. In other words, when a fish is born, they know what it is to be a fish. We humans haven't reached that.
Mm-hmm.
So we need a language that connects us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we want to have, a big vocabulary so that we'll be able to connect with each other to share experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop there.
Mm. Lots for me to go out and sit in my garden on my favorite rock and ponder, Leroy. Maybe we'll have a good dialogue with the rock and me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take the prerogative as the moderator to shift our intended agenda here. So we've talked longer than we intended, but everyone, I so appreciated what everyone said. So what we're going to do, unless I hear from James or Eleanor to the contrary, I'd like to open up for just a little bit of conversation between the panelists on what we see as common and what might be some new thinking about Paths Forward. So we'll do that a little bit. We're going to save the questions you may have put into the chat, but not go into them today. I'm sorry, I ask your forgiveness for that. And then we'll have just a little bit of time for a very quick checkout from each person, and then to Pari for their further words or final words that they want to give. So I would like to just ask our panelists now, what commonalities and what new thinking have come to you as we've listened to each other? And anyone who might wish to start, of the 6 of us here, would any one of you like to offer something as a start? For such a talkative group, you certainly are quiet all of a sudden. Yeah, Lee.
Well, just sort of in absorbing all of what we've been hearing, as much bodily as thinking about it,
Mm-hmm.
there's this feeling of movement, feeling of process. And of course, both of those things were absolutely central to everything that David Bohm was interested in and worked on. So that's one of the threads that I literally felt very strongly through what everybody's offered, and that is movement and process.
Yeah, I think I would attach to that the ways in which various people, Leroy, most of the last of us to speak, the non-language aspect of that movement. And I think that David Schrum was also going into the sense of mystery, and others, to some degree, it feels to me like there's something that is not articulated in language yet, but it may be needing to be given the opportunity to arise, as others have said. So that's a little bit disconcerting, because in our Western side and even here, we want to come out with something specific to follow up on. But I just want to echo what you all have been saying, that there's this feeling that's coming forward, but not yet presenting itself in a language form. Yeah, David.
Well, if language is a sign of primitiveness, and we are talking together, can we use language in a different way? Can we do a dance with language? rather than, you know, a formal march or, a journey to a destination? Can we, I'm just wondering, you know, can we move with language in a different way so that in its implications, it implies something outside the structure of language, outside the definiteness of language, the definedness of language. Language creates boundaries, it defines things. But can we use boundaries and so on of words to, you know, point to the possibility of movement that is not confined to boundaries? You know, it's interesting that about dialogue, I think the most important thing that, to me, that David Bohm said was, you know, we share each of our paths, all the different roads, and eventually, hopefully, we come to the point where we see that they're all just roads and each road is limited. And what we have to travel is the no road, you know, without method, without guide, you know, something subtler than direction, something subtler than words.
I second that, David, and I think it's very Taoist what you said. Lao Tzu would agree totally. The movement beyond the definiteness of language, and a language which can appreciate the wonder, the mystery. And thank you very much, Leroy, for pointing out this wonderful quality in Blackfoot language. All our relations.
I just want to give a word to Chris. I can't see Chris on the screen. So Chris, if you want to contribute, you need to just hop in with your voice.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating listening to all these ideas and really going into the philosophy and ideas about dialogue and so on. You know, I'm particularly struck again by this idea that we're colonized by language from Leroy. I mean, there's certainly a tradition in philosophy of science where this idea has been discussed. And I think, you know, it's especially, you know, we're colonized by language, we're colonized by culture. I mean, Bohr himself thought that we were constrained by the classical conceptual scheme, that was somehow a priori. We had to use it to communicate. Therefore, we had to have complementarity and so on, because there was no way beyond this. But of course, but Bohm obviously didn't agree with that. And I remember him saying actually that it was possible to, you know, to change our conceptual scheme. And the way to do that was through pursuing, you know, certain aspects of science. But the other thing that occurs to me is, you know, well, perhaps what we're trying to ask ourselves is it possible to construct a Bohmian science, you know, a different kind of science? And I just remember back in the 80s with a group of actually postgraduates from Birkbeck at the time. We used to discuss questions like, could there be a feminist science? Could there be a socialist science? And, you know, if there were to be such a thing, would it be different? You know, in what ways would it be different? You don't hear so much of that discussion these days. And I think as long as we have a science which is based on utility and the exploitation of nature, that we will, you know, we're just going to progress down the same road, peering through our microscopes and telescopes and particle accelerators, without, you know, thinking of different conceptualizations. So it's a very difficult question, I think, how we could ever, you know, build a Bohmian science, but we can certainly think of ways of, as Basil is doing, as Michael says, very much a lone figure in this, ways of trying to build a different way of thinking about quantum theory based on mathematization of process and so on. But I think progress will be limited, to be honest, because we have science which is based on exploitation and utility. Sorry, it's a little bit depressing that, but yeah.
I'm thinking about something I'm hearing from us right now in terms of directionality. And something I remember as well from Leroy's presentation a few weeks ago was talking about the idea of renewal and sustainability. And I'm wondering if we're also not colonized by our Western thinking about progress and about destination. And that maybe as another way in which it's not just the language, but it's really the orientation. I wonder what there might be to find if we go back to the beginnings. What is it that what's the role of renewal and how does that help us in sustainability? I think that's one of the questions I'm going to take with me as we move forward as well. One of those barriers that seem to confront us. I don't know if anybody else has noticed that. Yeah, Lee?
Just one other thought on the barriers and the boundaries that Leroy articulated so clearly. I think most of those barriers and boundaries that we're concerned with are the ones that we've created in our consciousness, not physical boundaries or barriers. And to the extent that that's true, I do think it's possible, how would you say it, that especially that these are constructs in our consciousness, that what in one moment is a boundary could actually become a membrane. Rather than something that separates us, it is precisely what connects us. So that if our boundaries and our partitions, through working with so many of the things and the tools and the maps that David has offered us, if those boundaries could become more permeable and become like membranes, there's a real intelligence in a membrane. It knows what to let through and let out, and it knows what not to let through and not to let out. So I think we could look to that kind of transformation of those boundaries into something that's actually creative.
Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative again as the moderator. I know that we're getting close to our bewitching hour at the top of the clock. So I'm going to ask each of us on the panel to give a very brief, 1 minute or less, what's your final word or final thought, something new you're taking with you, or whatever you would like to say in order to help us complete our session today. So we'll go in the same order. I'm going to ask Chris, could you give your checkout?
Well, I think I'd say it's, for me, it's more, thinking about how Bohm's deeper and wider ideas could actually change the physics that we do, and I think the only direction of travel there is along the direction of Basil Hiley in this group. Yeah, I'm afraid I think very much within the physics.
Yeah, sure.
Unless we start doing our physics in a totally different way, we could introduce dialogue into physics education and change the way, try and change that. But be honest, it's been hard enough trying to change quantum theory education between the two.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen. So, yeah, fascinating stuff.
Okay, so now I'm forgetting what order I went in. Shantena, any checkout words, any final words?
One wonderful meeting. I'm sorry I missed some of it because of internet connection. But what I will keep with me, one of the main aspects of this conversation is the issue of boundaries and moving to a perception of reality which is less conditioned by preconceived boundaries. Those boundaries might have been useful at some stage of our evolution, but we are now prisoners of them. And some of those boundaries separate us from our fellow creatures and the rest of nature. And moving beyond that type of language, that type of description of reality, that type of perception is crucial. And so I feel we've been like looking from various aspects to this like very crucial issue of how we move beyond our limited frame view of reality and its rigidity, its boundaries.
Right. Thank you, Shantena. So, David.
Well, the thing that is sticking with me is Leroy pointing out to us that language is a sign of primitiveness. And when I think, I generally think in words. And these words carry with them meanings. And my whole emotional structure has to do with these meanings. I have an emotional response because of the meaning I put on something. Oh, you know, they insulted me, or, or well, wasn't that nice what they, said, or whatever. So I'm carrying that forward, the whole sense of the incredible power of language to determine my life direction, my perception, and so on. Maybe more so than I thought. And it reminds me of something that I thought as a little child when I learned about dictionaries. And I found out that every word was defined in terms of other words. And I thought, well, what if you got the idea of the first word wrong? or somebody else's network will be different from mine, and so on. And I think this is really the same thing in slightly other words, I think so. And just something very brief, just kind of following in on Chris and science. I think perhaps there is a possibility of a new science which is not only scientific with regard to matter, it must apply the same principles with regard to the scientist. You see, like when we do experiments on a big accelerator, we have machines that analyze it. We have instruments that take in the input. We check out those instruments for artifacts and problems. We check the ways things are analyzed. We never check out the scientist like that, as to how the scientist is receiving inputs and processing. So if we're not scientific with regard to the scientist, I don't think that we can ever bring about the birth of a really new science. So I'll throw that in also. And so, and thanks to everyone, to all the participants. Oh, and one quick thing I'd like to say. I only realized recently the Fetzer Foundation is really the unsung hero of so much of this, starting way back with the Bailey Farms, Bohm meeting with the Blackfoot and Dave Peat there working with them and so on, and all they've done all the way through. So I just want to acknowledge that, they really are the unsung heroes of all of this. in a way.
Thank you, David. Lee.
Yes, part of what I'm left with is the question, can we enter the territory that David Bohm was pointing to? I mean, he's given us so much, so many marvelous maps and descriptions and guideposts, and I'm personally deeply enamored of all of those.
Mm-hmm.
But everything that he was talking about is bigger than him.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that he was talking about is different from him. If we can keep open the possibility of leaving all the maps, any of them, including David's, and entering that strange territory that we don't have a language for, and perhaps we don't need one in the way that we think of language. So I think that's something really valuable to think about going forward, is reminding ourselves not to be trapped in any map, including David Bohm's, and in that way perhaps be original people.
Thank you. Big thinkings. Okay, Leroy, I'm going to suggest you, and I'm going to go last then. So go ahead, Leroy.
Couple of thoughts. The notion about renewal is, from a Blackfoot point of view, it's a implicit, and in some cases, in many cases, explicit realization. We live in a very narrow spectrum of ideal conditions, we as humans, and we have to renew those conditions if we want to survive and continue to survive. And so if we play around with those conditions, we may not be around very long, you know, like my neighbor Neanderthal man who I used to text a little while back, but he's not there anymore, see. The other thought is that we have to remember when we're talking science, there is the science of the local, which we are in. There's the science of the small, subatomic, the science of the big, the cosmic. And in many cases, what we're trying to do is take the science of the local into the science of the small and into the science of the big. And the rules that apply in the science of the local just don't apply in the other two areas, see? And so we need to find the rules of the big and the small if we want to get into the areas that David Bohm is talking about.
Thank you, Leroy. Oh, I don't know if I can summarize in 25 words or less. I think at the moment it's a lot of I think what Lee said, a lot of body feelings right now of movement and things that want to pop into consciousness, but I think I'm going to have to go for a very long walk and let these kind of bubble forth, and for the newness and the, you know, it feels like some unrecognizable things that want to kind of come forth right now. So I'm really into the body part of this and the feeling level. I just want to say my deep gratitude for not only the 6 presenters who are here today who put up with my trying to orchestrate us and some of my clumsiness in doing that. I really appreciate your bearing with me and being here so fully. But all the presenters, and there are presenters who did wonderful works that weren't part of our panel today, and just to say you are a very valued part of this whole series that have gone on, and so to each and every one of those. But then to the participants, because you can't be a presenter if you don't have a really lovely audience, and you all have been so wonderful to work with. So we thank you for the receptivity that you've given to each and every one of us. And I think with that, I'm going to turn this back over to James and Eleanor and let you say your final words and then to dismiss us.
Thank you so much, Beth. I think I'm going to start. So it's now time to express my gratitude to a number of people. First of all, to all of today's panelists and to Beth, our moderator, for bringing the summer program to such a memorable and fitting conclusion. And second, I'd like to thank Paul Howard for allowing us to stream the director's cut of this great film, Infinite Potential. Already a tremendous success, and we believe that it's heading for even bigger things. And to, of course, to all the people that helped out backstage to make this event possible and supporting me along the way. So Chipman, Godlive Spas, Jenna Axelrod, and Alessandro Barbieri, and an extra special thanks to Julie Arts, Maureen Doolin, and James Peat Barbieri. And to all the people who were interviewed in the film who agreed to be presenters at the summer school. Some were with us on the panel today, and others are here in the audience. And every single one of you did such a fantastic job. We had such great feedback for all the sessions. Our audience just loved you, and we thank each and every one of you for taking the time, for putting in the work, and for helping make our summer program such a success. And now to the audience. You've been great, asking questions, participating in the discussions, giving us feedback, and being tremendously supportive of this venture. It was wonderful to see so many old friends, but also to welcome all of the new faces. You've now become familiar to all of us over the weeks, and we consider you to be a part of our Pari Center community. So thank you all, and please stay tuned for the next Zoom meetings that we have planned over the autumn and winter, which will continue this exploration of Bohm's work. I'm now going to pass it over to James, who has some announcements, but a very big thank you to everybody, and arrivederci.
Oh, thank you. And I do believe you have missed one name in those thanks. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, Mama, because she really did pull this off really well. We really couldn't have done it if it wasn't for her endurance, her great ideas. So thank you very much. And yeah, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much, Beth, for organizing this final session, and thank you so much for the panelists that came back to see us again. So yes, before we go, I'd just like to make a few announcements. First of all, I would like to say that after much demand, we are keeping the Sutra online forum active. We've seen that the forum has been very active in the last month. So we do encourage you all to keep it going, as many interesting discussions have risen and will arise, ideas that may inspire us even to go on and doing these great events. Also, given the success of this series, I can announce that we will be launching more events online. First of all, we will have a 4-week series with Nichol entitled Entering Bohm's Holoflux, Liberating the Explicate Order. This event will run every Sunday from the 4th of October to the 25th for a 2-hour session, and each event will be followed by an hour discussion on Wednesdays. For more information, you can visit our website. Our next online event will be a David Bohm dialogue entitled, Is There a Different Way to Talk Together? This event will be with Sally Jeffrey, Manfred Kritzler, Beth Macy, Carolyn Pollock, and David Schrum. The event will run on Saturdays from October 31st to the 5th of December. More information will be on our website very soon. Another way to get information on future events is to subscribe to our newsletter. It's a monthly newsletter. We usually send over essays, interviews, so please do sign up. I do also invite you to support the PORI Center to continue the work, the work that we're doing. To support us, I invite you all to become a friend of the PORI Center, our membership program. By becoming a member, you will receive a 10% discount on all of our events and receive our journal, the PORI Perspectives, which I have just over here. I recommend to become a member, especially now, as the PORI Perspectives will publish 2 issues this winter. The first is will be published soon this month, will be a special issue called the PORI 2020 to celebrate the 20 years of the PORI Center. The issue will include a collection of 20 essays from colleagues of David Peat. Some were our speakers during our series, and also 20 more essays by regular participants who have been close to the PORI Center. We will also be having the December issue, which will revolve around the work and ideas of David Bohm. Essays by some of our speakers as well. So I do recommend you all to become a member to get these very special issues. As always, to contact us, you can visit our website where we have the contact us section, or just send us an email with the email addresses, james@poricenter.com for me, and Eleanor@poricenter.com for Eleanor. Again, a massive thank you to everyone, and we'll see you again soon here at the PORI Center.
And to you, James. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you.
Thank you all.